Now, when people talk about resumes, or as I mentioned earlier, perhaps we're talking about curriculum vitae or CVs if we're here in Europe, I know that our listeners here come from right across the globe. So are there any subtle differences that you notice between different markets, different countries with the people that you've worked for, and also even different types of roles? Do they show up? Do they need to be taken into account as we're writing our resume and presenting it?
Yeah, it's funny because what I see is that the word resume and CV are pretty much interchangeable. A lot of it just depends on where you're coming from. But I've seen a certain convergence of the concept of resume versus CV, and it's becoming more streamlined where whatever you're calling it these days, it still needs to be accomplishment focused. I know in the U.S. market that a CV typically referred to the resume of somebody who was perhaps in the medical community or academia, and it was very strict on chronology and then had a lot of information about presentations and publications. And while that might still be true for those markets, that information is included, it's still becoming even more important to have something that's accomplishment focused. And during the time that I've been in the industry, I've seen other writers in other countries, and I'll use Australia or Canada as examples, really start to create resumes that are accomplishment focused across the board. It seems to be, that's more of the accepted way to present the document, whereas in the past, some countries, European countries, used to include information, personal information that was never really acceptable in the U.S. market, but has also been sort of scrubbed off of the European resumes as well. So I see it sort of coming together as one type of consistent document that actually can be used across different markets.
So what kind of personal information would you suggest that we should perhaps hold back from the resume?
I don't recommend that people list any information about their marital status, their family status, not country of origin, passport number. I've seen every piece of personal information imaginable on a resume, and those are not pieces of information that need to be disclosed, and they're not pieces of information that should be figured into the process when somebody's applying for a job.
And what about things like dates of birth or testimonials? Would you hold those off the resume?
I certainly don't recommend date of birth. Testimonials is different. Testimonials, I think, work nicely on a lot of people's resumes because it's allowing the reader to garner the perspective of somebody else through their words. So now it's not just you talking about your accomplishments, it's somebody else who's validating those accomplishments. So I actually think that testimonials are a nice addition to a portfolio, and if you look at LinkedIn and the use of endorsements there, that's a perfect example of showing how people want to see that information, and it is really valued on the resume.
Now, I think we've all been in that position, though, Barbara. Maybe you have as well, if you can ever think about it. I'm sure your resume is always updated, but I remember looking at a blank piece of paper and saying, I need to start this, or perhaps I wasn't so good at actually keeping it updated, and then all of a sudden it's like I'm applying for another job. Even if it was an internal job, we still need to have profiles for internal opportunities. It may not just be we're looking outside of a company for a position. But, the time came, it's like, okay, I've got to update this, or the last time I updated it was a year or more ago. How on earth do I do it? But sometimes we have a blank piece of paper in front of us. And, one of the things that I think is so important is having a really good and compelling introduction, because I think very often, I just know what I was like reading them. This is my declaring here. I would not very often scan them, but actually if something caught my attention in that first introduction, in that first paragraph or so, then I was more inclined to kind of go on and actually in further depth. I don't know if that's how you found other people read it, but I wonder if you can give us some ideas about how to craft a really good summary.
Sure. Actually, when people write their own resumes, I recommend that they work backwards, that you first look at all of the accomplishments and stories of success that you can, and then from there you sort of glean the highlights, and that becomes the focus of your summary. So if you go through a very simple exercise of looking at all the challenges that you faced in your various positions, the actions you took to address those challenges, and then the corresponding results, you can come up with some accomplishment statements. After you've done that, you can look at those statements and look at the themes behind them. So certain themes will emerge. Perhaps you're great at process improvements, or you're a thought leader, or you're great at saving money. Different themes will come up because of these accomplishments. Those themes can then be the big umbrella statements for your summary statement that you'd use on the top. So maybe you have 2 to 4 of those themes at the top. So it's actually easier to work backwards. It's really hard to look at the big picture and write a composite of everything you've done before you've really been introspective enough to think about what your accomplishments have been.
And I think that's where a professional resume writer or a career coach can really come into their own, because they can step back from it. And, they haven't been involved in those positions that you've been writing about and talking about. And they can often pull threads together, can't they? They can see a picture or a pattern that actually perhaps you hadn't even noticed.
Yeah, I mean, a writer is certainly going to have a certain amount of objectivity. The other thing I think about a writer is they're not as attached to the information, so it's easier for them to sort of figure out what's relevant and what's not. But I think the other thing is that, people don't think about this on a regular basis. They think about doing their job and getting it done. They tend to think about the task that they're doing as opposed to the unique value that they brought to the task. So this exercise really forces them to step back, or by having a conversation with a writer, it forces them to step back and think about these big picture initiatives rather than just writing about stuff they did, which is boring and not really what differentiates one candidate from the other.
Could you give us an example of maybe something that you might have crafted or helped reshape for a client in terms of what might have sounded blah,
yeah,
and one that sounded bling?
Here's an example of a typical profile that I might see on somebody's resume. This is an example of a financial professional. So the person starts out by saying financial professional with 15 years broad-based experience, strong background in strategic financial planning and financial analysis, analytical decision maker, skilled at solving complex problems involving the analysis and evaluation of intangible factors. So that was a statement that was on somebody's original resume, and to me, it just doesn't really say too much about the person. And I think there's also some attributes in here that a hiring authority would expect them to have as a candidate. So it doesn't really express how they can go above and beyond for that employer. So what I did is I worked with this person and, again, went through this introspective exercise, and I pulled out, sort of 4 of their key initiatives, and that became sort of their branding message of the information that was used on their resume. So rather than just saying that this person had 15 years of experience, we talked about what type of experience, and he had a lot of experience creating, streamlining, and automating accounting systems that saved the companies millions of dollars and reduced report turnaround time exponentially and improved accuracy. So what I did is I took the concept and the theme that was important, but I fleshed it out a bit more to show the audience quickly that here's somebody who's doing things smarter, faster, and more efficiently. I used a number of other bullet points. I talked about the fact that he had a strong record of success developing financial models that improved forecasting and inventory management and propelled the business forward. So again, sort of talking about a technical skill that he had, but not just the fact that he had it, but what he actually did for it. Knack for spotting cash management inefficiencies that cost companies hundreds of thousands of dollars annually and creating procedures to minimize the loss. So again, bringing new systems into play, more about the analytical piece, but digging deeper into it. And then for this particular candidate, he was also very interested in different software applications that would improve the quality of work. So we also had a point in there about being passionate about software applications that elevate data integrity and flexibility, and that he had trained other people on these softwares. So this brought together a lot of key components of his personal brand or his message, and not just the fact that he does financial work and he's analytical. I don't always format them with bullet points. Sometimes it's one overarching statement. But, again, it's hard to get to your key deliverables until you've been introspective about everything you've done in the past.